It's such a relief Daniel won't have to worry about supporting her now, my daughter-in-law said softly, just loud enough for the people around us to hear, as if I weren't standing 3 feet away beside my husband's casket. I smiled when I heard it, the same gentle, composed smile I had worn all morning, the kind that made people think I was holding up well for a 72-year-old widow, the kind that kept them from looking too closely at my eyes, because if they had, they might have noticed I wasn't fragile at all. I was paying attention. The funeral home smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of place designed to feel warm but never quite succeeding, and every chair in the front rows had been carefully arranged, every name on the printed program chosen with intention, except mine. I noticed that first. Not the flowers, not the whispered condolences, not even the absence of my husband's steady presence beside me, but the simple fact that nowhere on that cream-colored program did it say beloved wife. It said father, grandfather, friend, even mentor, but I was reduced to a passing mention near the bottom, as if I had been an afterthought in a life we had built together for over 4 decades. I took my seat where Daniel had directed me, not in the front row where I had sat for every wedding, every graduation, every milestone our family had ever celebrated, but off to the side, near the aisle, close enough to be seen, far enough to be forgotten. People glanced at me with polite sympathy, the kind reserved for someone they assumed would struggle financially now, someone they imagined would soon be selling her home or asking for help. I could see it in their eyes, in the slight tilt of their heads, in the careful way they spoke about the future, as if mine had suddenly become uncertain. Vanessa moved through the room with quiet confidence, greeting guests, accepting condolences, positioning herself as the center of everything, her voice smooth and controlled as she spoke about taking care of things moving forward, as though the role had already been handed to her. Daniel stayed close to her, nodding, agreeing, barely looking in my direction unless someone forced him to, and even then, his expression held something distant, something rehearsed. I folded my hands in my lap and listened, not just to the words, but to the spaces between them, to the assumptions being made in real time, to the story they were quietly building about me, a story where I was dependent, diminished, an obligation rather than a cornerstone. Someone behind me whispered that it must be hard for me now, that I'd probably need help managing things, and another voice responded with a soft chuckle, suggesting that at least Daniel and Vanessa were in a position to step in. I didn't turn around. I didn't correct them. I didn't need to. Because while they were busy rewriting my place in this family, reducing me to something smaller, something manageable, they had no idea that the entire foundation they were standing on had already shifted, and I had simply chosen not to tell them. I sat through the rest of the service without shifting in my seat, listening to the carefully chosen words spoken about my husband as though his life could be summarized into a few neat sentences, each one polished and rehearsed, each one missing the quiet details that had mattered most to us, the early mornings with coffee on the back porch, the long drives with no destination, the way he used to leave the kitchen light on for me when I stayed up late reading, and as the pastor spoke about legacy and family, I noticed how often Daniel and Vanessa were referenced as the future, as the continuation, as the ones who would carry everything forward, while I remained a silent figure in the corner, present but not truly included, acknowledged but not valued, and I found that I did not feel anger, not yet, only a slow and steady clarity settling in, the kind that comes when something you have suspected for a long time finally reveals itself without disguise. When the service ended, people began to stand, chairs scraping softly against the floor, and one by one they approached me with gentle smiles and careful words, their voices lowered as if I might break under anything louder, telling me how sorry they were, how strong I seemed, how lucky I was to have Daniel to take care of me now, and I thanked each of them with the same calm tone, the same composed expression, never correcting them, never explaining, because I wanted to hear it, all of it. I wanted to understand exactly what they believed about me, exactly how small my role had become in their eyes. Vanessa stood a few feet away, her hand resting lightly on Daniel's arm, guiding conversations, stepping in at just the right moments, answering questions that had not been directed to her, speaking about plans in a way that sounded generous but carried something else underneath, something calculated, and I watched as she told one of the guests that I would probably be moving somewhere more manageable soon, that the house was too much for me now, that it would make sense to simplify things, and Daniel nodded beside her, not looking at me, not once, as if the decision had already been made and my presence was simply a formality. I lowered my gaze to my hands for a moment, studying the faint lines and the ring that still rested on my finger, the one my husband had given me 43 years ago, and I remembered the conversation we had in his study just 6 months before he passed, the way he had closed the door quietly, the way his voice had softened when he told me there were things I needed to know, things he had arranged to make sure I would always be secure, no matter what happened, and at the time I had listened, with only half my attention, thinking we still had years ahead of us, thinking there was no urgency, but now those words returned with perfect clarity, fitting into place with everything I was seeing around me. The reception area was set up in the adjoining room, a long table with neatly arranged trays of food that no one seemed particularly interested in, and I followed the flow of people without hesitation, taking a small plate more out of habit than hunger, and as I moved through the space, I caught fragments of conversation, quiet assumptions spoken just out of reach, about what would happen next, about how things would be handled, about how fortunate it was that Daniel and Vanessa were so capable, so prepared, and I realized that none of these conversations included me, not because I was being deliberately excluded in an obvious way, but because in their minds, I had already been placed somewhere else, somewhere smaller, somewhere dependent. Vanessa's voice rose again, light and composed, as she spoke to another group about coordinating with a real estate agent, mentioning timelines, possibilities, even suggesting that it would be easier to make decisions quickly while everything was still fresh. And I paused just long enough to hear Daniel agree, his tone firm in a way I had not heard before, and that was when the final piece settled into place, not as a shock, but as confirmation, because this was not something that had started today, it had only become visible today, and as I lifted my eyes and looked across the room at the two of them standing together, confident and certain, I understood that they believed the future was already theirs, and I let them believe it. I set my untouched plate down on the edge of the table and stepped slightly away from the crowd, not to isolate myself, but to listen more clearly, because once you stop trying to be included, you begin to hear everything people assume you cannot, and the room felt different from that distance, less like a gathering of support and more like a quiet negotiation unfolding in plain sight, voices lowering when they thought they were being discreet, then rising again with confidence as if the conclusions had already been agreed upon without me. Vanessa moved closer to the far corner near the tall windows, drawing Daniel with her, and I followed at a slow, unhurried pace, careful not to draw attention, positioning myself just within earshot as she spoke with a man I recognized as a local realtor, someone my husband and I had met years ago at a neighborhood event, and I watched as she smiled, that same polished smile she had worn all morning, and said that timing would be everything, that it would be best to list the property soon, before the market shifted, before things became complicated, and Daniel nodded again, his voice quieter but steady, saying that it made sense to move quickly while everything was still straightforward. The word straightforward lingered in my mind, because nothing about the life my husband and I had built together had ever been simple, and yet here they were reducing it to a transaction, a timeline, a decision that could be made over a few conversations in a room that still carried the weight of loss. I kept my expression neutral as I stepped closer, just enough for Vanessa to notice me, and for a brief moment, something flickered across her face, not guilt, not exactly, but a quick recalculation, as if she had to adjust the version of the story she was presenting now that I was part of the audience, and she turned toward me with a soft, sympathetic tone, telling me that they were just discussing options, that nothing had been decided, that they only wanted to make things easier for me, and I nodded as if I believed her, as if I had not heard every word that came before, as if I had not already understood that these conversations were not new, that they had been happening long before today. Daniel finally looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second I saw something uncertain in his eyes, something that might have been hesitation or doubt, but it disappeared quickly, replaced by that same distant composure, and he said that they would handle everything, that I did not need to worry about any of it, that I should focus on resting, on taking things one day at a time, as though my entire role had been reduced to recovery, to quiet acceptance, to stepping aside while decisions were made in my name. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not the kind that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from understanding exactly where you stand, and I realized that this moment, this conversation in the corner of a reception room, was more revealing than anything that had been said during the service, because here, without the formality, without the structure, they were showing me what they truly believed, that I was no longer part of the foundation, that I was something to be managed, something to be moved, something to be considered only in terms of convenience. I adjusted the sleeve of my black dress and gave them a small, polite smile, the same one I had worn all day, and I told them that I trusted them to do what they thought was best, and Vanessa's shoulders relaxed just slightly at my words, as if she had been waiting for that permission, as if that single sentence confirmed everything she had already decided, and Daniel nodded once more, reassured, convinced that I had accepted the future they were planning without question. But as I turned away and walked slowly toward the exit, I could still hear their voices behind me, quieter now, but no less certain, and I realized that they had already begun building a life that did not include me, and they had made one critical mistake. They had assumed I did not see it. I stepped outside into the late afternoon air, the quiet hum of distant traffic replacing the low murmur of voices behind me, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to breathe without performing for anyone, without holding that careful expression in place, and I stood there on the stone steps of the funeral home, looking out at the neatly trimmed lawn and the rows of parked cars, all of it so orderly, so controlled, just like the version of my life they were already rewriting inside. And I found myself thinking not about what had just happened, but about a conversation that had taken place months ago, one I had not fully understood at the time. It had been a quiet evening, just the two of us in his study, the soft glow of the desk lamp casting long shadows across the room, and he had asked me to sit down, his voice steady but serious in a way that made me pause, and he told me there were things I needed to know, things he had put in place to make sure I would never have to depend on anyone, no matter how circumstances changed, and I remember smiling then, brushing it off gently, telling him we had always taken care of each other, that we always would, but he had shaken his head slightly, not disagreeing, just insisting, saying that sometimes protection did not look like what we expected, that sometimes it meant planning for the possibility that people might not act the way we hoped they would. At the time, I thought he was simply being cautious, practical in the way he always had been. But now, standing there with the echo of Vanessa's voice still lingering in my ears and the image of Daniel nodding beside her, I realized he had seen something I had chosen not to, not because I was naive, but because I believed in the version of our family I had spent decades holding together. He had walked me through the details that night, slowly, carefully, making sure I understood, explaining that certain assets had been structured differently, that ownership did not always appear the way others might assume, that control could exist quietly, without announcement, and I remember feeling a faint discomfort as he spoke, not because of the information itself, but because of what it implied, that there might come a time when I would need to rely on those arrangements, when I would need to stand on my own in a way I had never had to before. I had nodded, listened, even asked a few questions, but I had not fully absorbed the weight of it, not until now. A car door closed somewhere behind me, pulling me back to the present, and I turned slightly to see guests beginning to leave, their conversations already shifting to other things, to dinner plans, to the rest of their day, as if the chapter we had just closed could be neatly set aside, and I realized that for them, it could, because they were not the ones being quietly removed from the story. I reached into my purse and felt the familiar edges of the envelope I had placed there that morning, the one I had not intended to bring, not really, but had slipped in at the last moment without quite knowing why, and now I understood, because some part of me had already sensed that today would reveal more than it concealed. I did not take it out, I did not need to, not yet, because the power it represented did not come from being shown. It came from being known, and right now, I was the only one who knew. I looked back once toward the entrance, where Daniel and Vanessa still stood inside, framed by the doorway, speaking with the last remaining guests, their posture relaxed, their confidence unshaken, and I wondered, briefly, what they would say if they understood how completely their assumptions had missed the truth, how quickly the ground beneath them could shift if I chose to let it. But I did not move. I did not return inside, because there was no need to rush, no need to interrupt the version of reality they were so comfortable believing. Instead, I turned and walked slowly toward my car, the gravel crunching softly beneath my shoes, and with each step, the clarity settled deeper, not as anger, not as grief, but as something steadier, something far more useful, because they believed they had already begun the next chapter without me, and they had no idea that I had been holding the final page all along. I drove home in silence, the late afternoon light stretching across the windshield in long, quiet lines, and for the first time in years, the house did not feel like a place waiting for me. It felt like a place that had already been decided for me, as if something had shifted the moment I stepped into that funeral home and did not shift back when I left. And when I pulled into the driveway, I sat there for a moment with the engine still running, looking at the front door, remembering how many times I had walked through it carrying groceries, carrying birthday cakes, carrying the small, invisible weight of keeping a family together. And now I could hear Vanessa's voice in my mind again, calm and certain, speaking about timelines, about simplifying, about what would be easier, and I realized that in her version of events, I had already agreed to leave. I turned off the engine and stepped out slowly, the gravel crunching under my shoes just as it had earlier. But here it sounded different, sharper, more defined, and when I unlocked the door and walked inside, the quiet greeted me in a way that felt both familiar and new, because the absence of my husband was still there, heavy and real, but now it was layered with something else, something colder, something that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with clarity. I moved through the house without turning on the lights, letting the fading daylight guide me, passing the living room where we had spent countless evenings, the dining table where every holiday had been set with care, and I noticed how everything was exactly where it should be, untouched, unchanged, as if time had paused here while everything else had moved forward without me. I set my purse down on the kitchen counter and finally took out the envelope, placing it flat against the surface, not opening it yet, just looking at it, because it was not the paper itself that mattered, it was what it represented, the quiet certainty that everything they believed about me was built on an assumption I had never corrected. I could almost hear Daniel's voice again, telling me not to worry, telling me he would handle everything. And I wondered how long he had been saying things like that, how long I had allowed it, mistaking it for care when it was something else entirely, something that slowly moved me out of the center of decisions and into the background. I walked into the study and paused at the doorway, the room exactly as my husband had left it, his chair still slightly angled, a book resting open on the desk, and I stepped inside with a steadiness I had not felt earlier, because this room held the truth of everything we had built, not the version being rewritten in polite conversations and quiet assumptions. I sat down in his chair and let my hand rest on the desk, remembering the way he had looked at me that evening months ago, the way he had made sure I understood without saying everything directly, and now, with the house silent around me, I allowed myself to fully accept what he had been trying to protect me from, not just uncertainty, but the possibility that the people closest to us might one day see me as something less than what I was. The envelope remained unopened in the other room, but I did not feel any urgency to go back to it, because for the first time that day, I understood that I did not need to prove anything yet. I did not need to correct anyone. I did not need to interrupt the story they were telling themselves, because sometimes the most revealing thing you can do is let people continue exactly as they are, without interference, without warning. And I leaned back slightly in the chair, the quiet of the house settling around me, and I realized that tomorrow would come with new conversations, new assumptions, new plans made without me, and this time, I would be ready to listen. The next morning arrived without ceremony, just a quiet shift from darkness to light that moved slowly across the walls of the house, and I was already awake before it fully settled, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, the envelope still resting beside it exactly where I had placed it the night before, untouched, but no longer distant, and I found myself watching it not with hesitation, but with a kind of calm patience, as if I already understood what it would confirm and did not need to rush to prove it to myself. The phone rang just after 8, the sound cutting cleanly through the silence, and I let it ring twice before answering, recognizing Daniel's number before I even picked it up, and when I did, his voice was steady, almost rehearsed, asking how I was doing, telling me he had been thinking about me, that he wanted to come by later with Vanessa so they could talk about next steps, about making things easier, about helping me figure out what would be best moving forward, and I listened without interrupting, letting him finish each sentence, letting the words settle exactly as he intended them to, before I responded with the same calm tone I had used the day before, telling him that would be fine, that I would be here, that we could talk then. After I hung up, I did not move right away. I simply sat there, looking out the window at the quiet street, the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood continuing as if nothing had changed, and I realized that this was the moment my husband had been preparing me for, not the funeral, not the sympathy, but this, the conversations that came after, the decisions made under the surface of concern, the quiet assumption that I would follow rather than lead. When they arrived later that morning, Vanessa stepped in first, her expression carefully arranged into something soft and supportive, carrying a folder in her hand, as if that alone made everything official, and Daniel followed just behind her, his posture slightly tense but determined, and I greeted them both with a small, polite smile, stepping aside to let them in, noticing how naturally they moved through the house, how quickly Vanessa set her folder down on the dining table, how easily Daniel took a seat without waiting to be asked, as if they had already begun to see this place differently. Vanessa opened the folder and began to speak, her tone measured and reassuring, explaining that they had been looking into options, that there were communities nearby that would be easier for me, places with less upkeep, more convenience, that the house could be sold while the market was still strong, that it would be a smart decision to simplify now rather than later, and Daniel added that they would handle everything, that I would not have to worry about a thing, that it was all being done with my best interest in mind, and I sat across from them, listening carefully, not just to the words, but to the certainty behind them, to the way they spoke as if the outcome had already been decided, and this conversation was simply a step toward making it official. I folded my hands together on the table and nodded slowly, allowing a brief silence to settle between us, just long enough for them to feel comfortable, just long enough for Vanessa to relax slightly and continue outlining timelines and next steps. And in that moment, I realized something that made everything even clearer. They were not asking for my permission, they were waiting for my agreement, and they believed it was only a matter of time before I gave it to them, because they still saw me, the way they had described me the day before, someone who needed to be taken care of, someone who would not question, someone who would not stand in the way. I glanced briefly toward the kitchen where the envelope still rested, unseen by them, and then back to their faces, composed and confident, and I understood that this was not the moment to interrupt, not the moment to reveal anything, because what they were showing me now was far more valuable than any immediate reaction. And as Vanessa finished speaking and looked at me expectantly, waiting for me to respond, I gave her the same calm smile I had given everyone else and told her I would think about it, watching as that answer settled over them with quiet satisfaction, as if it was exactly what they had expected to hear, as if the next steps were already unfolding just as they had planned. They did not stay long after that, just enough time to feel accomplished, to gather their papers and repeat once more that everything would be taken care of, that I should not worry, and I walked them to the door with the same quiet composure, watching the way Vanessa glanced back at the dining table, as if she could already see it empty, staged for a showing, no longer part of a life, but part of a transaction. And when the door closed behind them, the silence returned, but it was no longer heavy, it was precise, almost deliberate, like a space that had been cleared for something else. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the door handle, replaying the conversation not for what had been said, but for what had not, the absence of any question, any hesitation, any acknowledgement that this house, this life, had ever been mine to decide, and I realized that their certainty had given me something valuable. It had shown me exactly how far they were willing to go when they believed no one was watching. I walked back to the dining table and sat down slowly, my eyes moving over the folder Vanessa had left behind, a detail I noticed only now, perhaps intentionally, perhaps not, but it did not matter, because what it contained was no longer important, not in the way it had been just an hour ago, and I opened it without urgency, flipping through pages filled with estimates, listings, timelines, each one laid out neatly as if the outcome was inevitable, as if my agreement was simply a formality. waiting to be confirmed. There was even a page marked with notes about preferred transition options, outlining places they had already researched, distances, amenities, costs, all organized with a level of confidence that suggested this had been discussed more than once, more than casually. And I found myself nodding slightly as I read, not in agreement, but in recognition, because this was not a sudden decision. This was a plan that had been forming quietly, patiently, long before my husband's funeral, long before the conversations in the reception room, long before they sat across from me that morning pretending to ask for my thoughts. I closed the folder gently and placed it back on the table, aligning it neatly as if I intended to keep it. And then I stood and walked into the kitchen, where the envelope still waited exactly where I had left it, untouched, unacknowledged, holding within it a truth that made everything in that folder irrelevant. I picked it up this time, feeling its weight in my hand, not heavy in any physical sense, but significant in a way that settled deeply, and I considered opening it, just to see the words again, just to confirm what I already knew, but I stopped myself, because the power it held was not in my awareness of it. It was in theirs, or rather, in their complete lack of it. I set the envelope back down and turned toward the window, looking out at the same quiet street, the same ordinary morning continuing just as it always had, and I thought about the way Daniel had looked at me, the way he had spoken as if I were someone who needed guidance, someone who would follow whatever path was laid out for her, and I realized that for the first time, I was seeing him clearly, not as the child I had raised, not as the man I had hoped he would be, but as someone who had learned to take rather than ask, to assume rather than consider. I did not feel the need to confront him, not yet, because what mattered now was not what I said, but what I allowed them to continue believing, and I understood that if I wanted to see the full extent of their intentions, I would need to give them space to reveal it without interruption, without resistance, without warning. I returned to the dining table and sat down once more, my hands resting calmly in front of me, and I began to plan not what I would say, but what I would not say, because silence, I was beginning to understand, was not emptiness, it was strategy. And as I glanced once more at the folder, and then toward the kitchen where the envelope remained, I knew that they were already moving forward with their plans, and this time, I would let them. I did not have to wait long to see what they would do next, because people who believe they are in control rarely move slowly. And by the following afternoon, Daniel called again, his voice carrying that same calm confidence, telling me they had scheduled a meeting with a real estate agent for the next day, explaining that it was only to explore options, nothing final, just a step to understand the process. And I listened without interrupting, noting how easily the timeline had advanced, how quickly thinking about it had become moving forward. And I agreed to be there, my tone even, giving him no reason to question what he assumed was my quiet acceptance. When the agent arrived the next morning, she stepped into the house with professional enthusiasm, complimenting the natural light, the layout, the condition of the property, speaking in terms of value and potential, and I watched as Vanessa guided her through each room, pointing out features, discussing possible upgrades, talking about listing strategies as if she were already the owner, while Daniel followed closely, asking practical questions, nodding at the right moments, reinforcing the impression that everything was already in motion. I walked with them, not leading, not resisting, simply observing, listening to the way they described the house, not as a home, but as an asset, something to be positioned, marketed, transitioned, and I noticed how neither of them looked to me for input, how my presence was acknowledged only when necessary, as though I were part of the background rather than the foundation. The agent eventually turned to me with a polite smile, asking if I had any concerns, any preferences, and Vanessa answered before I could, saying that I wanted something smaller, something easier, that I had already agreed it was time for a change, and I met the agent's eyes and returned the smile, offering a simple nod that confirmed nothing and denied nothing, and she accepted it without question, because everything around her suggested the decision had already been made. As they moved into the study, discussing square footage and potential pricing, I stepped back into the hallway and allowed the conversation to continue without me, because this was the moment I had been waiting for, the moment when their certainty would reach its peak, when their assumptions would solidify into action, and I knew that once they crossed that line, there would be no way for them to retreat into ignorance. I walked into the kitchen and stood for a moment beside the counter, the envelope still resting exactly where it had been, unchanged while everything else had begun to shift, and I picked it up again, this time without hesitation, opening it slowly, carefully, letting the familiar documents unfold in my hands, the language precise, the structure clear, confirming what my husband had explained months ago, that the ownership, the control, the authority they believed had passed elsewhere had never left me at all. I closed the envelope just as calmly as I had opened it and set it back down, because the revelation was not for me, it was for them, and timing, I understood now, was everything. From the study, I could hear Vanessa's voice rising slightly with excitement as the agent discussed pricing, mentioning figures that seemed large to her, numbers that she repeated with satisfaction, and I leaned lightly against the counter, listening as Daniel responded with quiet agreement, both of them unaware that the scale they were discussing was only a fraction of the reality they had never considered. I took a slow breath and straightened, the calm settling into something more defined, something intentional, because they had now moved beyond assumption into action. They had begun shaping a future based on a belief that I was no longer part of the decision, and that belief was about to be tested, not with confrontation, not with anger, but with something far more final. The simple presentation of truth at the exact moment it could no longer be ignored. I stepped into the study just as their conversation reached its most confident point, the agent's voice steady as she outlined listing strategies and projected timelines, her tone carrying that familiar certainty that comes when a deal feels inevitable, and Vanessa stood beside the desk with a quiet satisfaction she was no longer trying to hide, her posture relaxed, her smile unguarded, as if she could already see the outcome unfolding exactly as she had planned, while Daniel leaned slightly forward, asking one final question about closing timelines, his voice measured but assured, and neither of them noticed me at first, not until I spoke, not loudly, not sharply, just enough to shift the room. I said his name once, and he turned, his expression softening automatically into something polite, something practiced, the same look he had given me all morning, expecting agreement, expecting quiet acceptance, and Vanessa followed his gaze, her smile pausing just slightly as she realized I was no longer standing at the edge of the conversation. I walked to the desk without hurry and placed the envelope down between us, not pushing it toward them, not presenting it with any emphasis, simply setting it there as if it had always belonged in that space. And for a moment, no one spoke, because uncertainty has a way of silencing even the most confident voices. The agent stepped back instinctively, sensing that whatever was happening no longer involved her, and Daniel looked at the envelope, then at me, a small crease forming between his brows, and he asked what it was, his tone still calm, but no longer certain. I did not answer immediately. I only opened it and turned it so he could see, letting the documents rest there without explanation, because explanation was not necessary, not when the truth was written clearly enough to stand on its own. Vanessa leaned closer first, her eyes scanning the page quickly, then slowing, her expression shifting in a way she could not quite control, the confidence draining not all at once, but in small, unmistakable steps, and Daniel reached forward, taking the papers, reading more carefully, more deliberately, his posture straightening as the meaning settled in, as each line replaced the assumptions he had been working from with something entirely different. The room felt still in a way it had not before, not tense, not loud, just quiet, as if everything had paused to make space for understanding, and I watched them both without speaking, because there was nothing left to add. Finally, Daniel looked up, his expression no longer distant, no longer rehearsed, but searching, uncertain, and he said my name again, this time not as a formality, but as a question, and Vanessa said nothing at all, her gaze fixed on the document, as if looking away might undo what she had just read. I rested my hand lightly on the edge of the desk and met their eyes, one after the other, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with a calm that did not need to prove itself, and I told them, in the same steady voice I had used all along, that everything they had discussed, every plan they had made, every decision they had assumed was theirs to make, had been based on something that was never true, and I let the silence return after that, because it was no longer empty, it was complete. I did not wait for their response. I did not stay to hear explanations or apologies. because those would come later, shaped by realization rather than honesty. And I had already heard enough to understand who they were when they believed I had nothing. I turned and walked out of the room, leaving the documents where they were, leaving them with the truth they had never thought to question. And as I moved through the house, past the rooms they had already begun to imagine without me, I felt no urgency, no need to reclaim anything in that moment. Because ownership, real ownership, does not need to be announced. It simply exists, and for the first time since the funeral, I understood that I did not need to fight for my place in this life. I only needed to stop letting others define it. And behind me, I could hear nothing at all.